Breaking news today in the Ivory Coast. Laurent Gbagbo has been taken into custody, and that could end the civil war there after he refused to leave office last November after his defeat in the polls. It sparked a civil war. There's been a huge amount of violence. Well, CNN now has a reporter inside the scene there in Ivory Coast, in Abidjan. Dan Rivers joining us live. There's a bit of a delay on his satellite, but Dan, bring us up to date on what is happening there and whether or not the violence has quelled because of this.
Well, certainly we're still hearing sporadic gunfire here, but I think that the big picture across Abidjan this evening after Laurent Gbagbo was captured is that it's relatively quiet. That's to say that some pockets of his forces won't continue to try and engage their rivals following Alassane Ouattara, but it's certainly been a day of incredibly dramatic developments. Gbagbo, as you say, was hunkered down in a bunker underneath the presidential palace where he'd been surrounded for days, steadfastly, defiantly refusing to give up and stand down. Finally, he was flushed out. Now, there's a bit of controversy about who exactly went in there and got him, whether it was Ivorian or French troops. The UN and the French insist it was the Ivorians. Gbagbo's side, in turn, say it was French special forces. But as soon as he was taken out and taken to a hotel, Laurent Gbagbo very quickly told his forces to give up.
I hope that people lay down their weapons and return to a normal state of civil rule so that the crisis can conclude as quickly as possible.
It's still not clear whether his forces will heed that plea to lay down their weapons, and the big humanitarian crisis is clearly something that's going to have to be tackled fairly rapidly. There are big shortages of food and water here. As we drove in this evening, we're pretty much the only people out on the streets. There is a curfew in place, so it's still pretty tough here in Abidjan.
Dan, it seemed like a strange comment from a man who virtually started this civil war because he didn't leave office when he was elected out of that position. The authorities there seem to be going through great trouble to make sure that the legality of the situation is followed. In other words, they want to bring him to trial, not bring him any immediate harm. Is that to try and also convince his followers to put down their arms, that the president, the ex-president, will have his day in court?
Yeah, I think so. I think the orders were clear that he should be taken alive, and I've had the UN chief here talking about, if there is evidence of war crimes, that, anyone would have to be put on trial, and include Laurent Gbagbo. It has to be said that the forces loyal to Alassane Ouattara, his rival, are also accused of atrocities during this chaos up in the north. West of the country, some 200 people were killed, and reports on the ground there were suggesting it may have been Ouattara's forces who were responsible. Now, he's denied that, but it's not completely, black and white, this situation. There are clearly allegations and suggestions that both sides here have engaged in some terrible acts of violence on one another. The hope is now that perhaps that Gbagbo has finally been flushed out, that he's come out and asked his forces to lay down their arms, that perhaps this may be the beginning of a peace. But as I said, there is still sporadic gunfire here. Generally low. I think the city is a lot less violent than it was 48 hours ago.
All right, Dan Rivers and CNN in the Ivory Coast now to report on this. We'll look forward to your reports over the next several days, Dan. Dan Rivers in Abidjan, Ivory Coast.